You think you could eat your way through a medieval winter. No supermarkets, no ovens, no delivery apps, just frost, wind, and a stomach that roars louder every night. Imagine waking tomorrow in a mud hut on a frozen hill. No pantry, no sugar, no coffee. Just you a flock, and the cold stealing heat from your bones. In the Middle Ages, winter wasn't a season. It was a test. If you fed your body the wrong fuel, the cold won. And the deadliest mistake wasn't starving. It was forgetting the foods that kept people warm from the inside out. Dark loaves from harsh grains, roots pulled from earth like stone, milk still warm from the udder, meat hardened with salt, fish that time itself couldn't spoil, 7 peasant foods, ordinary, cheap, unstoppable. What were they? Who discovered them? And when the snow starts falling, would you know how to find, make, or preserve even one? Today we uncover 7 medieval survival foods that kept shepherds warm through the deadliest winters. Because when everything else freezes, your fire starts in your gut. When wheat failed, medieval families turned to the grain that refused to die, rye. Winter of 1316. Frost cut the harvest short, rains soaked the fields, and barns stood empty. For shepherds on the northern plains, the choice was brutal: eat rye bread, heavy and sour, or starve. This was no luxury loaf. Rye thrived where wheat collapsed, pushing through poor soil and cold winds. In desperate years, it became the only grain left to grind. And from it came the dark bread of survival. The process was rough. Rye kernels were crushed with stone querns mixed with water, sometimes soured with scraps of old dough, then left to ferment in smoky huts. Baked in clay ovens, the loaves came out dense, almost brick hard, with a sour bite that lingered on the tongue. Chronicles describe them as bread of the poor, mocked by nobles, but cherished by peasants. The taste, harsh, but inside that bitterness lay slow-burning energy. Rye's complex carbohydrates released heat, gradually keeping bodies warm through freezing nights. Its fiber filled the stomach, delaying hunger when meat was gone. Shepherds carried slices into the fields, chewing on them like medicine against the cold. Records from 14th century monasteries note that rye bread kept longer than wheat, resisting mold in damp storerooms. It was not sweet, it was not soft, but it endured just like the people who ate it. Even today, nutritionists still point to rye for its resilience, a grain built for hard times. For medieval shepherds, every heavy slice was more than food. It was survival baked into a bitter loaf, the shield that stood between life and the endless winter. When grain bins stood empty and meat was gone, our ancestors dug for a root that nobles dismissed: the turnip. Winter of 1317 during the Great Famine. Storms ruined harvests, sheep and cattle grew thin, and bread was no longer enough. In that desperate silence of hunger, thousands of families turned to turnips as their last dependable food. Not just any plant. Medieval shepherds knew that turnips thrived where little else would grow. Their thick skins resisted frost. Their flesh stayed firm underground. And with the right storage, they lasted through months of bitter cold. Families dug pits lined with straw, buried the roots, and covered them with soil to keep them safe until needed. The work was simple, but it carried rules. A turnip pulled too soon was small and woody, but left too long it spoiled. Harvesting had to be timed carefully, and in some villages, elders oversaw the digging to make sure no food was wasted. Preparation mattered. Peeled and boiled turnips softened into a pale mash with a faint sweetness that stretched thin supplies of butter or fat. Roasted on the hearth, they browned their sugars, caramelizing into quick energy. Even the greens were boiled into broth, so not a scrap went unused. Records from medieval England describe whole parishes surviving by root and leaf. Folklore called the turnip the meat of the poor because it gave strength when livestock could not be spared. To children, a boiled turnip was a toy and a meal at once held in two hands, steaming in the cold night air. The science is clear. Turnips supplied carbohydrates for heat, vitamin C, to ward off scurvy, and water that kept bodies hydrated inside smoke-filled huts. They were not glamorous, they were not sweet, but they kept shepherds on their feet when everything else failed. Even today, survivalists note how hardy turnips are. They do not feed pride, but they feed people. For medieval families, each root lifted from the ground was a victory over winter, a pale, earthy shield against hunger and death. When wheat was too fragile and rye too bitter, peasants leaned on another ancient grain, barley. Summer of 1316. Heavy rains drowned the wheat harvest, but barley, tougher and less demanding, still sprouted. For countless medieval families, barley bread became the bridge between hunger and survival. Barley had been with Europe since the Bronze Age, and by the Middle Ages it was known as the grain of the poor. It grew where wheat refused in thin soils and cold climates. Farmers sowed it not for prestige, but for endurance. And when famine struck, endurance was all that mattered. The process of turning barley into bread was crude. Grains were dried on wooden racks, then pounded or ground into coarse flour. Without much gluten, barley dough was heavy and flat. It often cracked in the oven, producing loaves closer to dense cakes than soft bread. To stretch it further, cooks mixed barley with whatever they had: pea, flour, oat husks, even acorn meal. Records from medieval England describe black bread of barley served in village feasts, while chronicles from Scandinavia note that shepherds carried hard barley loaves into the mountains, soaking them in broth to soften before eating. Folklore even claimed barley bread sat in the stomach like a stone, which for hungry bellies was a blessing. It kept hunger quiet for hours. Nutritionally, barley provided slow carbohydrates, steady energy, and soluble fiber that gave a lasting sense of fullness. Its minerals, iron, magnesium, and selenium, supported weary bodies weakened by cold and labor. Though it lacked the lightness of wheat, it had the strength of survival. The choice was stark. With barley, there was something to eat no matter how rough. Without it, fields lay empty, and so did stomachs. For shepherds, each flat, dark loaf was not a delicacy, but a line drawn against starvation. Even today, historians point to barley as the forgotten grain that kept medieval Europe alive. Not sweet, not refined, but in a winter that killed the careless barley bread was a humble wall between life and death. When cellars emptied and illness spread, one crop still hung in every home: the onion. Autumn of 1318. Grain was scarce, salted meat nearly gone, and families searched for food that could last. In dark storerooms, ropes of onions dangled from beams, their thin skins whispering of survival. Onions were more than flavor. In the Middle Ages, they were food, medicine, even currency. Shepherd families planted them in spring, harvested in late summer, then braided the stalks into long ropes. Hung in kitchens or cellars, each bulb was a quiet store of strength. Preparation was simple but vital. Onions were chopped into pottage, the thick stews that kept peasants alive, or roasted whole in the fire's embers. Broth boiled with onions, soften rough barley bread, turning it easier to eat. At times, raw slices with salt were the last resort. Records mention armies carrying sacks of onions, while monastery gardens set aside entire beds for them. Folklore called onions the poor man's spice, but healers prescribed them for coughs, fever, even wounds. Their sharp scent filled huts, a reminder of survival at the edge of winter. The science is clear. Onions offered carbohydrates for warmth, vitamin C to fight scurvy, and compounds that improve circulation. In frozen huts, better blood flow meant life. They also balanced diets heavy in salted meat, easing weak stomachs. The stakes were simple: Without onions, meals were thin and weak. With them, there was taste, heat, and a touch of health in every bowl. For medieval families, onions were more than food. They were medicine memory and a humble anchor through the coldest nights. When bread was scarce and livestock too precious to slaughter, medieval shepherds turned to a food both humble and immediate: sheep's milk. Spring of 1319. Hillsides were wet and thin with grass-grain fields failed and hunger pressed on every door. In that moment, warm milk drawn from the udder became the thin line between survival and collapse. Sheep's milk was never luxury. It was survival in a wooden cup. Thicker and richer than cow's milk, it carried more fat and protein, giving strength to bodies chilled by cold huts and long nights. For shepherd families, each ewe was not just an animal, she was a lifeline. The process was daily. At dawn, shepherds sat close to their flocks, warming numb fingers against wool, milking carefully by hand. The milk was drunk fresh, still steaming, or heated into simple porridges of oats and barley. Some became butter, some soft cheese, stored for leaner months. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. Records from monasteries describe cheese wheels stacked for winter, and folklore praised sheep's milk as the poor man's broth food that gave life without slaughter. In villages where animals meant wealth, milk sustained families while the flock endured. The science is plain. Sheep's milk, higher in fat and calcium than cows, gave dense calories and minerals to weary bones. Its warmth offered quick energy comfort against nights of frost. For children and elders, a single cup often meant another day of strength. The stakes were harsh. Without milk, hunger hollowed out families before spring. With it, there was warmth in the belly, a shield of fat and protein against the winter cold. For medieval shepherds, sheep's milk was more than food. It was survival in liquid form, life carried in every drop. When fresh meat spoiled quickly and hunger pressed in, medieval shepherds turned to one lasting resource: salted mutton. Autumn of 1320. After a poor summer, herds where thin hay was scarce, and winter carried the shadow of famine. Families faced a hard truth. Some sheep had to be slaughtered not for feasting, but to keep everyone alive through the freeze. This was no celebration. Slaughter came with the changing season when animals were leaner, but still strong enough to yield meat. The carcasses were cut into slabs rubbed with coarse salt and packed tightly into wooden barrels. Salt was precious, yet it was survival itself, drawing moisture from the flesh, stopping decay, and locking time away. The rules were strict. Cuts had to be small for the salt to reach deep. Barrels had to be sealed, stored in dark, cool cellars. Meat was checked, turned, and salted again if needed. Failure meant rot, and rot meant death. Records from monasteries describe whole stores of salted mutton kept for winter. Chronicles from Iceland and Norway recall families hanging strips in smoke-filled lofts where salt and smoke together preserved them for months. Folklore remembered salted mutton not as delicacy but as iron food, plain heavy but enduring. Science explains why. Salt prevented bacteria, leaving meat dense with protein and fat fuel for bodies working in the cold. Boiled into broth, each slice gave both salt and strength, warming shepherds who had little else. The stakes were simple. Without salted mutton, larders were bare, and hunger hollowed families before spring. With it, there was steady, if dull, survival. For medieval shepherds, salted mutton was more than food. It was disciplined foresight and the harsh art of turning sacrifice into life, a salted shield against winter. When harvests failed and herds grew thin, medieval Europe looked to the sea and found salvation in salted herring. Winter of 1322. Grain was scarce, livestock weakened, and hunger spread across villages. From the cold waters of the North and Baltic Seas came millions of silver fish, caught salted and packed into barrels that moved across the continent. This was not delicacy, it was survival at scale. Fishermen dragged in nets heavy with herring women cleaned and rubbed them with coarse salt, and merchants shipped the barrels inland. A single catch could feed thousands not with luxury, but with steady, durable protein. The rules were strict. Fresh herring had to be salted within hours, layered in thick crystals, until the flesh stiffened. Barrels were sealed and kept in cool cellars or shipped down rivers. The taste was harsh, the texture firm, but the fish endured for months when no other food could. Records from the Hanseatic League describe fleets carrying salted herring from Scandinavia to Germany, sustaining peasants and nobles alike. Chronicles tell of towns surviving entire winters on fish and salt alone. Folklore called herring the silver of the sea, not for wealth, but for the countless lives it saved. Science explains why. Salted herring provided protein and fat for warmth, omega-3 oils for health, and minerals to balance poor diets. Each bite was briny, but it carried energy to labor herd sheep or simply outlast the frost. The stakes were clear. Without salted herring, famine loomed. With it, there was life in every barrel, monotonous, salty, yet enduring. For medieval families, herring was more than fish. It was a silver shield against hunger, a gift of the sea that carried Europe through its deadliest winters. In the end, survival in the Middle Ages was never about luxury. It was about remembering the simple foods that turned hunger into endurance, bread black, as soil roots pulled from frozen ground milk, still warm from the flock meat, and fish hardened with salt, bitter, plain, heavy. Yet each was a shield against the winter of death. The lesson is clear. Survival does not come from what we desire, but from what we preserve. Knowledge carried forward food stored wisely, and the will to endure these kept families alive when the world turned cold. So ask yourself, if the storm came tomorrow, what knowledge would you carry? Which food would keep you warm? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want more survival, wisdom tested by centuries, subscribe, because the next winter is always closer than we think.